The Historical Society of the United States Court of Appeals for the Eighth Circuit and the United States Courts is pleased to bring you another in the series of video biographies of distinguished Nebraska judges. Today we are honored to have with us the Honorable Warren K. Urbom of the United States District Court of Nebraska, a senior judge on that court who has been an attorney and a jurist in Lincoln, Nebraska for about a half a century. Judge Urbom, welcome to you this morning.
Thank you.
You came from the little town of Atlanta, Nebraska, and I suspect if people were looking on the atlas, they'd say, where the heck is Atlanta?
Atlanta is on Highway 6. It's between Arapahoe and Holdridge, Nebraska, and has about 100 people, 99 now, and since I left, but I left when I was less than a year old, I think, so I really don't know much about Atlanta.
Were your family farmers?
Yes, my father was a farmer for lots of years, and his parents were farmers, and brothers and sisters were farmers, yes.
Of course, your biography says that you're a son of Arapahoe,
yes.
And we know that that's a bigger community.
Oh yes, 1,000 people there.
And that community was very good to the Urbom family, and there's several other Nebraskans who were from that community who have done very well in science and teaching and the professions and so forth. What were the schools like in Arapahoe?
What I supposed to be, and still supposed to be, quite ordinary schools. Good, but not fantastic. They gave you lots of opportunity to do whatever you wanted to do and be whatever you wanted to be, and I felt very comfortable in the schools there. Athletic program was very good. I didn't participate in athletics, but we've had some fine athletes come from Arapahoe. Music, that was a strong feature always of the schools. Science, literature, English, that sort of thing were prominent.
How many kids were there in your family?
In my family, I had one brother and one sister.
And where did you come up in that lineup? Were you the oldest?
Middle one. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now, as you went through the Arapahoe schools, and your family was in the farming industry, was there any idea that maybe you'd be a farmer, or did you want to go off and get a higher education for purposes of something else? And tell us about your boyhood in that respect.
I quickly decided I didn't want to be a farmer. And I grew up in the Dust Bowl days, you see, of the Midwest, and we experienced huge dust storms and thistles blowing all over the yard, and dirt piling up in the fences, and no rain. So that wasn't a life that I yearned for. The fact is, my father became interested in dirt moving and became ultimately an owner of a construction company, so that I worked for him after I got through with the Army and ready to go to college. I worked for him moving dirt with heavy dirt moving machinery, building roads and dams for farmers, and terraces for them to control the water. And so I've had lots more experience in that than I have in farming, and to my enjoyment. I like that. But I think it's fair to say that from the time I ever spent any time in school on, I figured that I would continue education. I enjoyed education. I enjoyed school. And since I was not athletic, I specialized in more scholarly things. I don't claim to be a great scholar. I claim to have enjoyed school, and I did. And I always had a knack for words, and so I thought of journalism. I thought of ultimately the ministry, and of I suppose law didn't cross my mind until my brother went to law school. And then I thought, well, maybe that's something that I could be interested in. But during my early elementary and high school career, I mostly worked in extracurricular activities like the journalism features, the yearbook and the newspaper, that sort of thing.
Now, you said you went into the service before you went to college.
I did.
What was the situation that got you into the service?
I graduated from high school when I was 16 and decided almost immediately after I graduated that I really wanted to go someplace else other than Arapahoe for the time being, at least. And so a friend and I decided we'd like to go to Denver. We got all ready to go to Denver, and he withdrew at the last moment. And I found myself being taken to Oxford to catch the Burlington.
That would be Oxford, Nebraska.
Nebraska, to catch a train to go to Denver. So I went to Denver. My family took me there to the train. I went to Denver, and there was, a little scrump of a kid on my own, scared to death, but thought that seemed like the thing to do. Independence was the driving force. So I got a job there with the Weicker Transfer and Storage Company, helping with people who had losses with this transportation company. If that transportation company would lose something or would acquire something that wasn't the rightful package to take, I was supposed to run it down, find out what was wrong, and cure it. So I did that for a year and a half, and when I became 18, I guess I was there a couple of years, and when I was 18, I was drafted, and I found myself in the Army almost by mistake. I forget the classification that I had, but because I had only one eye, I had a classification that meant that I wouldn't be in the very active service. They would tell me from time to time, come down to the draft office and we'll take a look. I would go report, and they would say, well, go back and we'll let you know. And I would go back home or back to work, and then I would find myself being called again to the draft office. And I would go. Well, one day they just kept me, put me on a bus and took me out to Fort Logan. I had to call my boss and say I was on my way to work this morning, but I stopped at the draft office and here I am in the Army. And I'm not permitted to leave the post. I can't even do anything more than make a phone call like this. And here I am with my hair all cut off, and I've tried to learn to salute, and I'm in the Army. Well, I couldn't even leave the post for 2 or 3 weeks. So I had that unfortunate experience of being drafted and surprising my boss by just
surprising yourself, huh?
And surprising myself. It was, but I stayed there for a couple of years during World War II. See, World War I had begun in December of 1941, as far as our participation is concerned, and I then came into the service in 1944, and stationed at Fort Logan, Colorado, and I was doing desk work. I worked in an office of a reception station, which means getting people involved in the service as they're drafted or as they volunteer. And then as the war ran down, the reception station was changed into a separation center. So I kept the records of the people who, as they were being discharged from the Army, and all the time I spent in Denver, except for a month when I went to a school in Fort Sam Houston in Texas for the purpose of learning how to run an office for the government. And that was a good experience. Ultimately discharged, went back to Arapahoe, worked for my father.
Now, when did you decide to go to college, and how did the decision to go where you went come about?
From the time I left high school, I took courses of one kind or another by mail or by attending part-time at schools in Denver. When I then got discharged from the Army, I went home and didn't quite know what to do other than my father offered me a job running these dirt moving machines. And one day during that first summer, 1944, I had what I classify as a religious experience and decided God...
Had your family been deeply involved in Methodism?
No. I don't think I had any church experience or religious experience with my family as such. Well, my brother and sister and I went to church. My parents once in a while. So later in life, they became very active in Methodism, but not when we were growing up. They were busy working and all that, and little involved in church or religious matters.
Sure.
But I particularly took to it, enjoyed it, and then here I found myself having this experience out as I was driving, a big machine, and I thought, God is calling me. So the only thing I knew about the whole subject of getting an education with respect to some religious organization was that Nebraska Wesleyan University was connected with the Methodist Church. Mm-hmm. So I suppose that was the natural thing to do, go to Wesleyan, Nebraska Wesleyan. I did.
Now you got the GI Bill.
Indeed I did, and that was a saving feature because that helped me. And with the GI Bill and the job I had with my father, I was able to find myself going to college comfortably without having to work during school term. So I could concentrate on my studies, and I vacillated all the time I was at Nebraska Wesleyan between the ministry and the law and journalism, and finally decided, by finally I mean by the time I graduated from college, sure, I decided I needed to be a minister. So I was scheduled to go to Northwestern University to theological school, was registered there, and then the very last moment when I got into the summertime after my senior year in college, my father said that I don't have work enough for you this year, so why don't you go do something else like tasseling corn? I chose instead to go to Isla School of Theology for the summer. And at Isla School of Theology during the summer, I decided this isn't for me. I must have been mistaken when I thought God was calling me to the ministry. I think he wants me to go somewhere else. So I applied to 3 law schools, and University of Michigan accepted me, and University of Nebraska accepted me. University of Michigan said, well, we require our people to take an entrance exam, and you haven't taken it. But on the basis of your academic record at Nebraska Wesleyan, we'll let you come without having taken it. But when you get here, we want you to take the entrance exam. So I did. University of Nebraska let me come as I was if I had chosen it. Harvard didn't bother to answer. So I went to the University of Michigan.
Now, when you were in college at Wesleyan, were there pre-law activities, or were you motivated by any person in your hometown, or what drew you to the law?
I suppose partly my brother's involvement. I think he graduated from law school in 1948, and I graduated from Nebraska Wesleyan in 1950. So he was in law school and then practicing law while I was in undergraduate work. And so that's part of it, I'm sure. I had a speech teacher, Enid Miller Hoffman, who was particularly instrumental in my growth at Nebraska Wesleyan. And she thought that the ministry was fine for me. She thought law was fine. She thought journalism was fine. She encouraged me by saying, once I had said, maybe I'll go to law school, even though I didn't do that immediately after undergraduate work, she said, the University of Michigan is the place to go. That's the one that's up and coming and moving even more than Harvard. What she knew about it, I haven't the vaguest idea. But it didn't matter to me that she said it was enough for me. See, so she was an impact on me, and I loved speech. I was very active in debate and other forensic subjects, and I didn't major in speech, but was very active in debate and discussion and oratory, that sort of thing. What else drew me to it, I can't tell you, except that when I went to seminary, the big item at that particular moment in the religious world was counseling. I knew I didn't want to be a counselor because you never end counseling. It never quits. I needed something that you bring things to an end. And I thought, law does that, particularly trial work. I can combine the speaking with the bringing things to an end, with trials that stop things, solve problems, and you move on. You move to the next thing. That's right. So that was my process.
When you were in law school, were there a number of extracurricular activities in which you could do that kind of thing, or classes, or did you have experiences in law school? Yeah.
Yes. Well, it wasn't extracurricular. At the University of Michigan, we had a course in trial advocacy, which was an unusual thing in those days to have courses in trial advocacy. Yes. We did that. We also had moot court, which was argument before a court in an appellate situation. Sure. So I took all that I could get and found that I loved trial work. And then as soon as I was finished with law school, looked for a trial job.
Mm-hmm. Did you decide that you were going to come back to Nebraska, or were you tempted to go elsewhere?
My wife and I sat down one night.
Oh, wait a minute here. Where do we get this wife?
Well, from Nebraska Wesleyan. She and I met there. And
where was she from?
Grand Island, Nebraska. We took to each other pretty well, pretty quickly.
Pretty quickly, huh?
Yes, we did. And I discovered her in a church. She was giving a worship service at First Methodist Church across the street from Nebraska Wesleyan. I saw her, and she was absolutely radiant in that little role. And she was an actress. She was busy in dramatics at Nebraska Wesleyan and other speech activities. So a time came when we hadn't really met in an official way, nor even in an unofficial way, until a woman who was the head of religious education at First Methodist Church across the street saw me one day and asked if I would be willing to be with somebody else. No, yes, I have it a little backwards. It was Joyce she talked with, Joyce Crawford. Mm-hmm. She talked to Joyce Crawford and said, would you be willing to be on a panel with somebody else, just two persons, to talk to a group of junior high students about how to get along with the opposite sex. And she said, I think that'd be fun. And so the woman said, would you like to do that with Bill Weddle or Warren Urbom? And Joyce said, why, Bill Weddle, Warren Urbom doesn't know anything about sex. And so I happened to see that same woman, and the woman said to me, would you be willing to do this? And I said, yeah, that'd be fine. So I saw Joyce on the street one day, and I said, I guess you and I are in this. And she said, we are. Yeah, we're going to do it. So we did it. I said, let's go to the library and see what we can find out about juveniles. And she said, you really find out about things like that in the library? I said, oh, yeah. So we went to the library. We did that. We went that weekend and spoke to the youth group, and they liked it, and they invited us to come back, and we did that. Well, there's nothing to do, of course, when you're through except to go to lunch, go to supper. So we went out to dinner, and we went to a movie, and that started the whole thing. And first thing you knew, we were engaged to be married.
Oh, wonderful.
It was.
Wonderful.
It was.
So you decided that you were going to settle in Nebraska after law school.
Yeah, we did that because we sat down one night and figured up all of the minuses and the pluses of the different places we could live. I had supposed I would go back to Colorado because I loved Colorado. Sure. I loved Denver. And so in the courses in law school, we were to pick a state where we probably would end up, and I picked Colorado, and all my law school courses then were aimed at Colorado. And she thought that that would be great, but so would other places. We had an opportunity at Michigan, and we thought Michigan would be a great place. Her parents by then lived in, I think they lived in Columbus, Nebraska by the time I graduated from law school. And my parents lived in Arapahoe. Lincoln would be about halfway between the two of them. Mm-hmm. And we'd be not with our parents, either pair, but close to both. Mm-hmm. So as we wrote all the pluses and minuses, Lincoln won by a landslide. Mm. So we decided that's the place to go. The only problem is we don't have a job there.
How did you go about getting a job in a law firm in those days?
Just write to the law firms and say, I'm available. Do you need a person who would like to be involved in the trial law? And it developed that Baylor, Evnen, and Baylor wanted somebody who was interested in trial work. So they asked me to come back and interview, and I did, and I liked them, and they said I would be all right, I guess. And so Mr. Baylor, who was a University of Michigan Law School graduate, right. And so that fit.
Now, F.B. Baylor, F.B. was what he was known as. Yes. He was a very distinguished lawyer. As I recall, Mr. Baylor, he always wore his vest. Yes, sir. And I asked his son John one time, why do you always wear your vest? And he says, well, because we could sport our Phi Beta Kappa keys that way. Yes.
I suspect that's true. F.B. Baylor, I always called him Mr. I never got to the place where I was comfortable in calling him Bill, so I called him Mr. Baylor. Mr. Baylor was a mentor of mine, became almost like a second father, and I admired him very much. He was very honorable, very honest, and some very strange things about him, but there are strange things about everybody. And he was just a great man as far as I'm concerned, and taught me much about the trial work. He pressed me to do things that I thought I never could do. For example, he's the one who said, you ought to select the jury without any notes. You memorize their names so that you can, and something about them so that you can talk to them and interview them and select the jurors that you need to challenge by memory. And I said, I can't do that. I just don't have that kind of memory. And he said, I think you do. So he suggested a few ways to go about it. I finally tried it. Sure enough, it worked. And I did that thereafter, and I suspect that I learned as much from him as as to trying lawsuits as I ever learned from any other source. You always learn from your opponents, of course. I learned a lot of things of those lawyers who did things that I didn't know anything about or had never the nerve to try. And once I saw them do it, I thought, okay, I'll try it.
Now, the nature of the practice in your firm was emphasis on trial work and insurance defense. You did Mr. Ebden did workers' compensation stuff. What other kinds of things did the firm do?
Did all kinds of things. It did anything that came in, of course, as most law firms do. If someone wants you to handle a problem of his or hers, they come in and we're glad to do it. We didn't turn anything down, I think. But we did mostly defense of automobile accidents or other kinds of accidents covered by insurance. So most of them were trials of injuries of some kind. Mostly we represented the insurance company and the defendant. But we represented plaintiffs whenever we could without conflict of interest. We also did wills and estates. We did contracts. We did some real estate work, lots of workers' compensation. Most of the real estate matters we didn't do was because we weren't proficient enough, because we didn't have enough of that business to be real expert. So we farmed it out to other persons, or at least recommended someone else to do it. But mostly we were trial persons. John did trial work, John Baylor. FB did. He was in the process of pulling out of trial work by the time I came. So I got to try a few lawsuits with him, and he second-chaired me on some. I second-chaired him on most. But when he got injured in an automobile accident himself, he asked me to defend him.
Now, you know, Judge, you participated in that case. I think his name was Baylor versus Terrell.
Yes. And
all my career, I've held that brief in Baylor versus Terrell up to my students as an exemplar of the finest brief writing I've ever seen. And I've never asked you before, was that your work?
Yes, it was.
Well, it was just an absolutely beautiful job.
Thank you. I worked hard on it because it was...
Well, I kind of figured it, you did this for the boss.
Yes, I did. I did. I tried the claim for the boss, too. The trial was for him. And a kind of remarkable thing about it was that he was a fellow who made up his mind, and that was it. That doesn't mean he didn't negotiate. He did. But he negotiated toward his goal. And he made up his mind that his goal was, I think in that lawsuit, $12,500. And he didn't start with that as the demand, but I negotiated for him, went under his direction. But he never wavered from that, and they wouldn't come to 12.5. I think they reached maybe, I've forgotten exactly, 13.5 maybe, and he said no, 12.5. And so we tried it, and I think the verdict was about 12.5. I think just about exactly. It might have been a little above his request, but he was a man of strong conviction. He just believed that was what his claim was worth.
In that office at that time, was there motivation of moral equivalency, if you will, for you to get involved in activities in the community with respect to church or other kinds of things that made you a full lawyer?
Yes. Yes, Mr. Baylor was not a church man. He was a spiritual man, but not a church man. But felt keenly that involvement in church matters was important for anybody who thought that way. And I thought that way, and so I became very involved in the church, not because of him, but with his blessing. John was very active in church work. High Evelyn was a Jew, and he was active in his denomination. And he felt that there should be service to the community. And so all of us were involved in community affairs, as he was. He believed that lawyers should be broad in their knowledge and understanding, and part of that understanding is working directly with people in their problems, not just solving their legal problems, but helping them with their daily work, daily activities, and daily problems.
Now, was anybody in the law firm political in that there was involvement in the political party process? And what I'm going to get to here is how you became known to the officialdom to boost you into this august position of being nominated for a United States District Judgeship eventually. Or was this just because you were a special lawyer?
I can't honestly answer that. I can tell you what happened and what I know about it. The only person I think who was involved politically was John. John Baylor was a Democrat and somewhat active in the Democratic Party, I think. I don't think High was a Republican and not much involved. I wasn't involved at all in politics. I think I went to one meeting of the Republican Party. I was a Republican, not having been raised as a Republican. I don't know what my parents were. I was an independent when I was in college, registered as one as soon as I became old enough to be registered. Then at the University of Michigan, I became enamored of Adlai Stevenson, so I switched to the Democratic Party. When I moved to Nebraska, I recognized that it was pretty thoroughly Republican, and so I switched to the Republican Party. I mean, talk about somebody with no convictions. I guess that was me. But I was not involved in Republican politics at all. I know that all I did was try lawsuits, and I don't know where the inspiration came to anybody to be on my side. I don't know. What I know is that I received a telephone call after I'd practiced law for 17 years from Judge Van Pelt, who was the United States District Judge, and I knew that he was in the process of announcing a retirement. I got a call from him, just a message to my secretary saying, to ask me, are you a Republican or a Democrat? And I said, I'm a Republican. I had responded to the call. And he said, that's all, thank you very much. A week later, I received a call from Dick Smith, who was a Republican and was chairman of the campaign for Senator Curtis. He was the chairman of that campaign for Curtis. And Dick said, are you coming to the Bar Association meeting tonight? And I said, yes, I think so. He said, well, let's have a talk. And so we met at the Cornhusker Hotel for a visit, and he said, Robert Van Pelt is going to retire, and there has to be a replacement made, and I, Dick Smith, have the job if I want it, but I haven't made up my mind. I want to know if you're available if I say no. And I said, yes, I am available. And he said, all right, I'll try to let you know soon. Next thing that happened was that I received a call from Senator Curtis calling me from Washington saying, if you're interested in this job, come and see me. So on the following Wednesday, I went to see him in Washington, and we talked, and he took me to see Senator Nebraska. I had never met him. I think it's fair to say I had not seen Senator Curtis since I was about 12 years old.
Oh, good.
Yeah, I saw him once because my uncle Elmer Leaf lived in Minden. He had a daughter named Dorothy who was my age, and she died. And Marjorie was her name, I'm sorry, not Dorothy. And Marjorie died, and so my Uncle Elmer invited me to come to Minden to spend a week with him and his wife. I did, and before I left, he said, there's one person I want you to meet, and he's a young lawyer in town. And so he took me down to Carl Curtis's law office. Carl Curtis was bundling up all his books and things to move to Washington. He had been elected the previous November for the first time to the House of Representatives. And so I met him. You know, what does a 12 or 13-year-old boy say to a senator anyway?
Yeah.
No, you're a congressman. I said hello, and that's about all, and Uncle Elmer did the visiting. But at least I got to visit him. I got to meet him. And so here, years and years and years later, I met him again in Washington, D.C. I don't know how it came about that he was on my side, and he was. And he stayed with me during the whole process, and was very strong, very, very helpful, very kind, and he saw me through the process. There was a problem. Senator Fresca wanted me to live in Omaha. If I were to be, he said, he came to visit me in my office in Lincoln after I had been to Washington to see him and Senator Curtis. Senator Fresca said that I would become the chief judge in a couple of years because Judge Robinson would be taking senior status, and the next person up I would be, I guess, because Judge Van Pelt retired and Robinson retired. I would be the chief judge. So he said chief judge should live in Omaha, and I assume he said that you would be willing to live in Omaha. And I said, I wouldn't mind living in Omaha, it's perfectly all right, but I don't think I can make any commitments of any kind of what I will do once I become a judge. So I can't say yes and I can't say no. Wherever I can best serve the court is where I want to be. And if that's in Omaha, that's fine. If it's in Eagle, Nebraska, I'll live there. Doesn't matter. He then wrote a letter to the president. Judge Curtis sent me a copy saying Judge or Mr. Urbom won't commit himself to live in Omaha. So I suggest we just pass over him and go to somebody else to be the judge now. There will be another judgeship, we think, open because there is a bill in Congress now that will give Nebraska another judgeship, and Judge Urbom could become a judge then. And in the meantime, we can get somebody else for this job. Senator Curtis wrote to the president then saying, I don't agree. We ought to go ahead with with Mr. Urbom. 6 months went by, approximately, without any decision being made. Other people were rumored to be possible persons to get the job, including Don Ross. Things bumped along, and the newspapers took up the cry, and ultimately Don Ross withdrew, saying that he'd taken the job with what, General Mills maybe, or some, I've forgotten now the name of the company he went with. Ultimately, the time came when Senator Nebraska was involved with other nominations to the courts, but in these instances to the Supreme Court of the United States. When I went to see him, back when Senator Curtis summoned me to Washington, Senator Nebraska was involved in Clement Haynesworth's nomination, and he was very busy, and I got to spend very little time with Senator Nebraska because he was involved in the Haynesworth matters and needed to get over to a meeting for that. But then when Haynesworth was not accepted, he withdrew because of problems. The next one I think up was Carswell.
Carswell, sure.
And Carswell was on a rocky road, and that's when Senator Nebraska made his statement to the press that maybe people are entitled to a little mediocrity, and even if Carswell is mediocre, which I don't think he is, he said, maybe it'd be all right to have some. and Mr. Carswell didn't make the grade either, and so that was when Senator, within 48 hours of that, Senator Nebraska said, Urbom is okay. Let him go. Let him go. So I was nominated then by the president and was approved by the senators, and it was quick work then after that.
You know, in your career as a judge, you never unitasked. You always had other things going on that were very important to people around you. Your teaching, for example, at the University of Nebraska in trial advocacy, which had been the love of your life in the professional sense of the word. Your service and devotion to Nebraska Wesleyan's board. Where did you have time? How did you find the time to do all these things and do them as well as you have done them?
Teaching was a kind of necessity. We had children in college, Joyce and I, by that time, and we needed the money. Mm-hmm. And I loved the idea of teaching, but I, like you, wondered why I could have the time to teach. As it developed, I called the dean of the law school one day and said, if you ever have an opening for me, I would like to give a shot at teaching. And he said, you're in. And so I took a job with the University of Nebraska Law School of teaching that one course in trial advocacy. That very fall, which was the fall of 1969, I got a call from a chief judge in Missouri saying, we need some help down in Missouri trying lawsuits. We've got a case now that is a huge monster, and every judge down here is involved in some way, close enough politically, that they all have recused themselves, and we'd like you to come and try it. And so I said, oh, well, I'll do that. So I took that, went down there in about August, and that's about when the first class of that course was to begin. Mm-hmm. And so I went to Kansas City to try that lawsuit, and by hook and by crook, it took a year to try that case.
Well, as I recall, Judge, this became part of the Urbom legend, with you going down to Kansas City and then coming back here to Lincoln and doing your docket on the weekends and your other responsibilities as well.
Yeah, that's true. I had to work it out some way, because the class is supposed to be taught in the evening, see, and like 2 nights a week, I think, an hour and a half each class period, on Tuesday and Thursday. Well, I couldn't do that, because if I was down in Kansas City, I couldn't drive back that much, I thought. So I taught the class on Saturday morning, drove to Kansas City on Sunday, tried the case down there until Friday night, drove back to Lincoln on Friday night, taught the class on Saturday for 3 hours, and then taught a Sunday school class on Sunday morning, and then drove back to Kansas City on Sunday afternoon and started the trial again on Monday. That went on for a year. And and being the first year of that class, that wasn't easy, because I had to try to find time to decide what am I going to try to teach this week in the midst of all that. It was not an easy task, but it turned out to be very interesting, very fun. I enjoyed it greatly, and so I kept at the teaching of that class for 10 or 11 years. I think 11 years of it. But other years are easier, because I didn't have to commute to Kansas City.
Sure. Now, you and Mrs. Urbom have raised a beautiful family. Tell us a little bit about your kids.
We have 4 children.
And grandkids, of course.
We have 4 children and now 12 grandchildren. The 4 children consist of 3 girls and 1 boy. The oldest girl now is married and lives in South Sioux City, Nebraska, soon to live in Chicago. They have 4 children, and they are all either have graduated from college or are now in college, those 4. We just today have come back from South Sioux City, where they presently live. Their youngest child goes to the University of Nebraska now, and is an undergraduate. She'll be a junior next year. And the others have gone on to other higher degrees. That's my first child is Kim, and she's the mother of those 4 children. The next is Randy, who is a lawyer practicing in he actually practices in it's hard to know where he practices. Practices out of his office at home in Scottsdale, and he has a little office in Phoenix as well. So that's where he practices. And he has 2 boys, and so there's 2 grandchildren who live there. The next child is Allison, who lives in McKinney, Texas. She has 3 children, and she is a nurse of a splendid reputation and honor. She's a delightful person, and I love her as I love all my children. But she's of a particular interest and closeness to me, I think, probably because of her problems. But that's a part of life too. The youngest is Joy, who lives in St. Louis. She's a lawyer, practicing. She has practiced with a large firm there for a time. Now is with a firm made up, I think, primarily of women, and she has 3 children of her own, so that she has to be at home a good deal of the time, raise those children, but practices law also. And so she does that same kind of back and forth work, where she goes from a little town of Eureka. They live there in Missouri, and then it's about, I think, 40 miles into her office, and she commutes into that. It may not be that far, but it seems that far. And they're delightful 3 little kids. So we've got 12 of them. They're scattered around the country. They keep us busy traveling to see them.
Now, one of your other long-time loves has been for Nebraska Wesleyan.
Yes, sir.
And your service on the board of directors there. resulted in a honorary doctorate. So I call you a doctor judge.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. They granted me that a few years ago. I've been on the Board of Governors, it's called, for almost 50 years. 50? No, must be 40. Must be 40. I graduated from there in 1950. I went on the Board of Governors in 1957. Mm-hmm. Well, I guess it will soon be 50 years, won't it?
You bet.
Yeah. 57 or 58 I went on. So it's been 49 or 50 years. Mm-hmm. And I love being on it, even though I'm on emeritus status, so I don't have a vote. But I have a voice, and so I can speak if I want to. Sure. I can think if I want to, and I want to keep up with it because it's a grand institution, and I'm not much help to it, but I want to know what's going on. I want to encourage its activities and push it along. I want to give what I can to it, and I want to be familiar with what it's doing. Because education, in my judgment, is as high not only a profession, but as high a value as we have in our society. So I believe very strongly in it and want to give what I can to it.
Well, I'm just thinking that over those years you must have seen the administration of the school change a lot. I mean, you've gone through a lot of presidents in the time that you have been there.
No, three. Three presidents. See, the first president when I went on was Vance Rogers.
Oh, sure, Dr. Rogers.
And he stayed on for 20 years.
Many years.
Then Dr. White, John White, for 20 years. Then Dr. Watson, who stayed, I think, 7, and that's all. So now we are about to get a new one. And I've been involved in the selection of all those. And that's been an exciting experience. I was not involved really in Dr. Rogers' selection, but I was involved in Dr. White's selection and Dr. Watson's selection, and now the new person will come aboard. He hasn't yet come aboard, but will come aboard in the 1st of July, and I'm hopeful that he will have a long stay with us now too.
Another 20-year president.
Another 20-year would be good. I understand that's not the usual thing.
No, it isn't.
And some people think it's not a good idea to have long ones. So far, our experience with long-term presidents has been excellent.
Long-term judges, though, is a very good thing.
I think it is.
I would think you're fully apprised of all of the debates that have gone on about people who want to limit the term of judges and get them in and get them out. What is your own thinking on the longevity of judges who are compos mentis and are doing the job? Why should we change them, or what is your thinking on that?
There are pros and cons. There are strengths and weaknesses in both positions. I think that it's best up to the person to decide, the judge himself or herself. A person has to be of a good mind, of a good judgment, and of a good health in order to remain on the bench for a long time. Sure. And if a person has those, and he probably or she probably is the best judge of that, but not the only judge. So I think the persons who are close to the judge ought to help in that decision. I think my wife, I think my family, other family members, I think my law clerks, I think my secretary, I think the people who work closely with me and live closely with me ought to be the ones to help me decide whether I should stay or not, for how long. I propose to stay on for as long as I want to, as long as I can, but I realize that my skills are not what they used to be, and I ought to be looking toward the time when I am no longer an active judge. I've cut back my caseload considerably.
But you know, they joke in the District of Nebraska that when Urbom and Strom cut back their caseloads, they're only working full-time.
Well, that's interesting, but not very true. I don't work very hard. I think Strom works a good deal harder than I do. Well, he came on late, you know. He was an older man before he came on. But I don't work as hard as I want to, as I have to. I only work as hard as I have to, put it that way. I've cut my loads down now. I only carry about 50 cases a year, or 50 cases at a time, which really amounts to about 50 cases in a year. Whereas in the heyday of the 80s, I carried over 600, and sometimes tried 2 cases on one day. I mean by that, we would try one case from 8:30 in the morning until 1 in the afternoon, and then take a recess, go to the next case. We try it from 1:30 until 7:30 or 8 o'clock at night. And we did that for 5 weeks running at one time. And so that we were continuously running cases, 2 at a time. It doesn't mean we would try 2 cases in one day, but 2 different ones we would try the same day, and it would fill up a week or 2 at a time. But I don't recommend that to anybody. I'm only saying we did that because we had to. We had that many cases. Now it isn't that way. We're busy, and other judges with me are busy, but they don't have nearly that kind of caseload, although the cases they have may be of longer average. I'm not sure that's true. But at least they can afford to let me have only 50 cases and still get along, and so they do that with good grace and let me do it. Strom carries more than that, but he doesn't carry as many as the other full-time judges do.
We've been visiting with the Honorable Warren K. Urbom, United States District Judge for the District of Nebraska, in another of a series of video biographies of distinguished American jurists brought to you by the Historical Society of the United States Court of Appeals for the Eighth Circuit. On behalf of the Creighton University School of Law and Professor Barbara Gaskins, this is Richard Chagru thanking you for being with us.